It's genuinely massive. It's really important in the history of the monarchy. So the King and Queen have announced that they're not going to ever live at Buckingham Palace.
The doors of Buckingham Palace have never felt heavier. For decades, the British monarchy survived wars, abdications, scandals, and the kind of public hatred that would have destroyed lesser institutions. It bent, it adapted, it endured. But what King Charles III authorized behind those closed doors, with senior royals watching, advisors holding their breath, and Camilla waiting only steps away, shook the very foundation of the House of Windsor in a way that nobody, not historians, not constitutional experts, not even the royal family themselves, saw coming. The King of England stripped his own wife of her title as Queen. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a temporary suspension, not a quiet reshuffle, a permanent, irreversible royal declaration, signed in Charles's own hand, that officially ended Camilla's position as Queen Consort and returned her to the style of Duchess of Cornwall, the same title she wore before the crown ever touched her head. Now the world is asking one question louder than any other. Why would a man who fought 30 years of public fury, relentless media humiliation, and the court of national opinion to stand beside this woman suddenly take a pen and strip everything away? The answer is more complicated, more painful, and more explosive than the headlines suggest. Because this was not simply a palace administration decision. This was the result of a private war that had been building inside royal corridors for months. A confrontation at Windsor that crossed every line, a folder pushed across a table, a wedding ring removed and placed beside an unsigned document, and a family that finally had to choose between loyalty to one woman and the survival of an institution that belongs to the ages. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand exactly what happened, inside the meetings, behind the closed doors, and in the final moments before the king put pen to paper and changed everything. Stay with us, because this story is only getting started. The declaration that stopped a nation. The morning felt deceptively ordinary. Charles sat in his office at Buckingham Palace, flanked by two senior advisors. A formal royal declaration, a written order issued in the sovereign's name, rested on the polished desk in front of him. The document stated in careful constitutional language that Camilla would cease using the title of Queen, would withdraw from duties tied to the sovereign's constitutional role, and would return publicly to the style of Duchess of Cornwall. William had arrived alongside Catherine after an urgent summons. Princess Anne had entered alone, exchanging a single guarded look with her nephew before taking her position. Camilla herself waited nearby, separated from the king by nothing more than a closed door and the weight of everything that had happened between them. Charles read the final paragraph twice. Then he asked, one last time, whether any path remained that could protect the crown without destroying his marriage. Neither advisor offered comfort. The crown represents the monarch's legal authority, his public duty, his obligation to preserve the institution beyond personal loyalty. That obligation has never bowed to emotion. Not in this family, not in this institution. He lowered his hand and signed. When the private secretary entered Camilla's room, she did not move. She accepted the declaration standing, read it silently, and slowly sat down. Her face hardened as she reached the final paragraph. There was no reference to illness, no suggestion of temporary leave, no mention of future restoration. This was permanent. Everything she had fought to secure, through scandal, through public hatred, through years of being treated as the most despised woman in Britain, had ended with her husband's signature. Now, here is the question you need to ask yourself. How does a marriage survive that moment? How does a man justify removing the title he personally championed, publicly defended, and constitutionally secured for the woman he loves? And more importantly, what on earth happened to bring the most powerful monarch in Britain to that precise, devastating decision? The answer begins not with a document. It begins with one explosive evening inside St. George's Hall. The night everything broke. Understand this first. The crisis that ended Camilla's queenship did not arrive through a leaked letter, a hostile newspaper investigation, or a public scandal. It arrived in a room full of family members during what was supposed to be a routine debrief after a Commonwealth ceremony. For months before that evening, Camilla had been watching the palace shift beneath her feet. William and Catherine were being consulted first on major household decisions. They were being briefed earlier, trusted with responsibilities that once would have passed through her office, and visibly positioned as the coming face of the monarchy. Camilla read that pattern for what she believed it was, not preparation for a future reign, but a quiet, deliberate campaign to make her irrelevant while the king was still alive and on the throne. She carried that conviction into the Commonwealth ceremony, and what she witnessed there only sharpened the wound. During the diplomatic reception sequence, palace officials turned repeatedly to Catherine for direction. The Princess of Wales handled it with the kind of calm, practiced authority that draws admiration without asking for it. Senior staff praised her afterward, and every word of that praise landed on Camilla like an accusation. Catherine had not asked for the attention, but Camilla understood exactly what it meant. Every successful appearance by the future queen strengthened confidence in the next reign. Every conflict surrounding the current court made transition planning more urgent. The writing was on the wall, and it was written in Catherine's handwriting. So Camilla walked into the private family briefing inside St. George's Hall, that grand stateroom at Windsor used for major royal gatherings, and she did not arrive to review the ceremony. She arrived with a demand. Charles expected a short procedural meeting. William expected routine assignments. Instead, the Queen Consort demanded final approval over all future Commonwealth hosting duties. Charles refused, explaining that his son needed to begin assuming greater responsibility. She did not accept it. With the Prince of Wales seated directly across from her, Camilla accused William of operating a shadow court, a rival power center running alongside the reigning monarch. She told Charles that his heir was actively weakening royal authority before the reign had even ended. Charles ordered her to stop. She pushed a folder across the table and demanded written control over the Wales household's ceremonial role. Think about what you just heard. A queen consort, in a formal royal briefing, demanding written authority over the heir's household, in the presence of the heir himself. The room did not simply change temperature, it changed nature entirely. William remained still. His silence carried its own warning, the kind that people who understand power recognize immediately. Charles told his wife to withdraw the demand. She shut the folder, looked directly at him, and declared that she would not be treated as a temporary figure, while his son prepared to replace them both. Charles removed his glasses, placed them beside the briefing papers, and dismissed everyone except Anne. When the door closed, he told his sister something that confirmed what she had feared. Camilla had turned a household dispute into a direct challenge to succession planning. Anne urged him to act before resistance hardened into open division. That same night, the king instructed his private secretary to begin a formal review of every privilege, authority, and ceremonial function attached to his wife's title. The process had begun, but Camilla was not finished. The confrontation that changed everything. No courtiers, no private secretaries, no family members positioned to soften the language or redirect the conversation. Just a husband and wife facing one another across a polished table in the king's private sitting room, with an unsigned declaration lying between them and 30 years of shared history pulling from every direction. Camilla had demanded the meeting the moment she learned her privileges were under review. She told Charles directly, if he intended to dismantle her public life, he would have to do it while looking her in the eye. Charles entered that room believing there was still room for mercy. His proposed settlement was designed as a compromise. She would keep the title, but surrender several household duties, staffing powers, and areas of ceremonial control. The arrangement was built to preserve the appearance of royal unity while quietly removing the authority that had caused the conflict. Camilla read the proposal once and pushed it back. A title without influence, she told him, would reduce her to decoration. Losing everything openly would be less humiliating than pretending she still mattered. Her voice stayed calm throughout, but the accusation beneath every sentence was brutal. Then she said the words that ended the compromise. William, she told him, had been allowed to dictate the terms of their marriage from outside the room. Charles finally broke his restraint. He told her this was not about his son's ambition. It was about her direct refusal to respect boundaries established by the sovereign. Boundaries whose authority within the royal household admits no exception and no negotiation. Defending her now, he said, would mean openly admitting that his own command could be ignored without consequence. Camilla answered that she had stood beside him when the entire country treated their relationship as a national disgrace. He replied that love could not excuse a challenge to the next reign, and then the king opened the folder from St. George's Hall. Inside it were written instructions Camilla had attempted to send to senior household officials, ordering them to bypass the Wales team entirely and report ceremonial decisions directly to her office. Documents that transformed suspicion into proof. Paper evidence that the Queen Consort had not simply argued for greater influence. She had attempted to covertly redirect the institution's internal chain of command. Camilla stared at the pages, and then she slowly removed her wedding ring. For several seconds, it rested on the table beside the unsigned declaration. The gesture hit harder than any shouted accusation could. Then she placed it back on her finger, told him she remained his wife, and said she would never forgive being judged like a disloyal courtier. She left without looking back. Charles waited until the door closed, crossed out the paragraph offering compromise, and summoned his secretary with a single recorded instruction: prepare the permanent declaration. The silent alliance. Royal power does not move with shouted commands. It moves through sealed folders, carefully timed meetings, and agreements reached before the public knows a decision is being made. And behind Charles's declaration stood a quiet alliance that had been taking shape for longer than anyone had admitted. The monarch, the heir, Anne, and the documented evidence that Catherine had spent months quietly gathering. William understood the weight of what he was being asked to support. Endorsing the decision could protect his future reign, but it would permanently alter his father's private life, fracture the household, and place him in history as the prince whose cooperation ended a queen's title. That is not a comfortable position for anyone. During the private council at Windsor, Charles entered carrying the declaration but refused to place it on the table. He needed to know whether the institution could survive the decision before he accepted what it would cost him personally. A senior advisor asked directly whether the Queen Consort should retain any influence during the future transition of power. William looked toward a photograph of Charles before answering. Personal mercy, he said, could not justify institutional confusion. His voice tightened because he understood those words would reach the monarch, not merely as advice from an heir, but as judgment from a son. Anne refused to allow the room to shelter behind procedure. She asked directly whether they were protecting the monarchy or simply punishing Camilla. Charles said nothing. William answered that punishment would mean public humiliation, while protection required a controlled and dignified withdrawal. And then, Catherine's documented notes arrived. For months, the Princess of Wales had privately recorded every intervention from Camilla's office. Interference with Wales' household arrangements, ceremonial planning, and staff appointments. She had maintained those records not as ammunition, but because each intervention weakened the clear division between the current court and the future one. The St. George's Hall confrontation was not an isolated incident. It was the final act in a documented, verifiable pattern. The argument was settled. Charles imposed one non-negotiable condition before signing. Camilla would retain her private residence, financial security, personal protection, and place as his wife. The declaration would remove her from constitutional authority. It would not permit the decision to become an act of exile. Anne accepted, William accepted, and Charles signed. Within hours, sealed instructions reached palace staff, ordering them to remove the Queen's designation from official schedules, correspondence, and future ceremonies. By morning, Camilla would see her name changing across the very institution she had spent years fighting to enter. Now here is where the story stops being about titles and politics and becomes about something painfully, recognizably human. When the plaque bearing Camilla's former designation was removed from her office wall, she stopped the footman before he could take it into storage. She asked him to leave it on her desk. When her sister Annabel arrived and found her holding it in both hands, Camilla tried to make a bitter joke about finally having space in her diary. The words broke apart before she could finish. She cried. And in that private moment, she admitted what she had never quite said aloud, that she had expected criticism, anger, even scandal. She had survived all of it before. But she had never believed that Charles would personally authorize the removal of everything they had fought to build together. Annabel reminded her that she was still his wife. Camilla answered that being loved privately does not erase being rejected publicly. By midday, her household had begun to shrink. Constitutional briefings stopped. Official engagements disappeared, transferred to Anne, Catherine, and other working royals. Longtime aides chose to resign rather than transfer into the reorganized household. Their loyalty comforted her, but it also confirmed the truth she had been refusing to accept. Her official operation was not being reduced. It was ending. Then William's handwritten note arrived. The prince acknowledged the pain the decision had caused and promised she would not be publicly degraded or separated from the family. He did not apologize for supporting the declaration, and that honesty, that refusal to offer false comfort, unsettled her more deeply than a rehearsed consolation ever could have. When she requested a private meeting with William, no lawyers, no palace officials, no Charles. She was not seeking a reversal. She was seeking an honest reckoning from the man she believed had helped end her reign. The private reckoning. Camilla chose a small library at Clarence House, not Buckingham Palace, not Windsor, a quieter room, stripped of official weight, where the conversation could be personal rather than procedural. William arrived without documents, without briefing notes, without staff. When she noticed his empty hands, he told her simply, he had not come to defend procedure. He had come to answer her directly. She did not waste the moment. She asked whether he had wanted her removed from the beginning, whether every polite exchange between them over the years had concealed the same private judgment. William answered that he had accepted his father's marriage years ago. He had never asked Charles to choose between his wife and his son, but two centers of command around the throne, competing authorities pulling household staff and ceremonial decisions in different directions, would confuse the institution, weaken the current reign, and poison the next one before it began. The answer was honest. It was not cruel, and for Camilla, a woman who had spent decades being lied to by public relations, that honesty landed differently than she expected. Then William did something she had not anticipated. He acknowledged what she had endured. He told her that the family understood the years of public hostility, the relentless judgment, and the support she had given Charles during the most difficult stretches of his public life. Losing the title, he said, could not erase that sacrifice. She had walked into the room expecting an accusation. Recognition was far harder to receive. Her anger began to weaken, and in the space that opened, she admitted the truth she had not spoken to anyone, that fear had driven her actions. Catherine's growing authority and William's expanding responsibility had made her feel herself disappearing. Every demand she had made for greater control had been an attempt to secure permanence before the next reign arrived and made her irrelevant. William replied that the constitutional chain of command could not extend her authority beyond Charles's reign, but the family still could. He promised she would retain a private place beside the king and within family life, even without shaping official decisions. After a long silence, Camilla agreed not to challenge the declaration. She asked only one thing, that Charles never be forced to condemn her publicly. William gave his word, and then she made the decision that would define how history remembers this moment. She would appear beside the monarch once more, not as queen, but as his wife, and allow the country to see that surrender had not meant abandonment. The world watches. By morning, the announcement had escaped the palace and consumed everything. Broadcasters abandoned scheduled programming. Newspapers rebuilt their front pages. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, staring at gates and windows, searching every movement for meaning. The constitutional language of the declaration was technical, controlled, and precise. The public reaction was none of those things. Television networks described it as the most dramatic change to a living royal consort's status in modern memory. Commentators split immediately over whether Charles had acted from necessity or surrendered to pressure from within his own family. Some praised the monarch for placing duty above emotion. Others condemned him for withdrawing the very title he had spent a decade defending publicly. Inside Kensington Palace, Catherine watched the coverage from beside William and felt the danger immediately. She knew that her growing role would be interpreted, by some loudly, angrily, as the cause of Camilla's removal. Every future appearance she made as the future queen could now be read as proof of ambition rather than service. William took her hand and told her that protecting the crown sometimes meant accepting blame without the ability to answer it. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd had gathered beneath a newspaper front page carrying the headline, "The Queen No More." Voices rose, arguments flared. Cameras turned toward the gates, and then Camilla's car appeared. The crowd fell quiet. Hours later, she appeared beside Charles for a brief departure from the palace. She walked half a step behind him, without the insignia of her former position. At the car, the king turned, extended his hand, and waited, with the entire world watching, until she was seated before joining her. That gesture restored nothing. It reversed no decision and returned no title, but it told the country something the palace statement never could. Charles had separated his wife from the structure of queenship without separating her from his life. What remains? After the cameras moved away from the gates and the shouting faded from the front pages, only the real accounting remained. What had been saved? What had been destroyed? And what Camilla's acceptance revealed about the institution that had demanded such an enormous price. Camilla formally accepted the style of Duchess of Cornwall and surrendered every duty connected to queenship. Palace calendars were rewritten. Ceremonial responsibilities were redistributed. No challenge followed. The royal household returned to one unmistakable chain of command under the king, and the path of succession stood clearer than it had in years. William's position as heir was no longer shadowed by competing authority. Catherine's future role was protected, and the institution that had bent under the weight of this family's private war remained. Wounded, yes, but stable. Charles found Camilla in their private apartment after the final papers reached the palace. He told her quietly, almost carefully, that the institution was safe. She told him that she had once believed becoming queen proved every year of scandal, rejection, and public judgment had been worth enduring. Now she understood that remaining beside him without the title would demand a different kind of courage entirely. Charles told her that the declaration governed the crown, not his devotion. He had separated the power from the marriage, and the marriage remained. Camilla lifted the old office plaque from her desk, placed it inside a drawer, and closed it firmly. Then she joined him for dinner, not as a sovereign figure, but as the woman he had chosen, through everything. At the next private family gathering, William approached her before she could turn away. He greeted her warmly and stayed beside her long enough for the meaning to be unmistakable. Their relationship had not become affection overnight, but hostility had given way to recognition, and recognition had established the kind of respected distance that families surviving serious fractures learn to inhabit. She accepted his gesture. He accepted her place. The lesson the House of Windsor delivered that day was not subtle, and it was not kind, but it was final. Love can survive the crown, but it can never be permitted to command it. The declaration was signed, the title was surrendered, and the family moved forward, changed permanently, but no longer divided over who holds the authority of the crown. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think King Charles made the right decision, or did he sacrifice the woman who stood beside him through his darkest years for the sake of an institution? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a royal update. This story is far from over.